Hi, my name is Gloria Kaba. I'm an engineer, producer, and writer based in New York City. Today, I'd like to talk to you about mixing in Pro Tools. I'll talk to you a little bit about how I organize my sessions, how I build my static mix. We'll talk about applying EQ, compression, and effects. And at the very end, we'll talk a little bit about getting your mix ready for mastering. The song I'm showing you today is a song by a Toronto-based artist, Looney, and it's a fun R&B pop song that she sent me a little while ago. But I'll show you how my approach to how I started that mix and how I progressed through it. I'll show you quickly. Actually, I'll explain before I start a mix. I have a conversation with the artist or the producer about what their ideas for that mix might be. Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes they do have a bit of an idea stylistically where they want to go. And that might also include getting references. So that would mean other songs that they liked. It might be the mix. It could be the way the vocals are treated on one and the way the vocals or drums are treated on another. So we'll talk about those things and then I'll get into it. I'll ask for stems as WAV files, and I'll use these audio files in my template session to build my mix session. Now, templates are really important to integrate into your system, especially if you are mixing pretty regularly. It just cuts down on the time it will take to route your tracks and instantiate your plugins. This way everything's set and routed and all you have to do is import those stems. So let's get into it. I'll show you quickly a screenshot of my template session. Here it is. Stand by. Actually, this is my mix session. Here's my template session. So my template session is pretty straightforward. In it, I'm creating, just a bunch of buses that I would need and create anyway. So as you can see here, I've got a drum bus, a drum comp bus, which is something I would use for if I was doing any parallel compression. You got some bass buses, lead vocal bus, lead comp bus, and then it goes on and on. I also create what I call my stem buses, which is really great in when I'm creating stems, but also when I want to affect a group of tracks. And it's just great to have, especially when I get notes back and an artist might say, hey, I'd like the vocal up 1 dB. It's very easy to just go to those stem tracks and boost the level. Down at the bottom I have my effects tracks. As you can see, it's reverb, delay, modulation, goes on and on. I also have a pre-mix track where I will send all my buses to, and then I have a print track where I print my final mix. Okay, so that's my template session. Very important to implement if you want to move a lot faster when mixing. Okay. Now here we are. Here is the mix session for Looney. And I'll play a little bit of it so you get an idea of what we ended up with. Here we go.
5 a.m. and I've been waiting on your call. Oh, it's a real good game that you're playing on me. 5 a.m. and I'm driving where you want. Oh, it's a real good game that you're playing on me.
Lately, so poison. All I can do is stop me. Got a real quick temper, far from a beginner. I don't really think I had a chance here. Eyes I can never forget. I can never focus. Heel toe stepping, make dance in the whip, and I ain't never really been a fighter. I just get so tired of being good. Ooh, so tired of being. I just get so tired of being good.
And there it is. It's a really fun song. I mean, I had a lot of fun mixing it, and it's very great. I mean, I love the arrangement. The arrangement is great. So it was fun to mix. But the first thing I do once I import the stems that I receive from the artist or producer is I will import them into my session and organize. I will organize the drum groups together. I usually have my session laid out in the same way. So I have drums, you know, followed by bass, and then the musical elements. And then, you know, we got guitar in there, we got pads. Towards the end, I'll have vocals. My vocals are always at the bottom. And I do it the same way every time. I usually actually use the same color coding schemes, just so that when I look at my session, I know where everything is. I know that, oh, okay, my drums are at the top, they're red. My vocals are at the bottom. They're usually yellow or green or some shade similar to that. You know, labeling is also really important. You know, if you're working with an organized client, sometimes you will get them named and you won't have to do much after that. But other times you will have to listen through to figure out what instrument is which and, you know, label them accordingly. So as you can see here, I've got my session, my tracks laid out. Let me show you my edit window. Down here, we've got my drums, and as you can see, they're all routed to a drum bus, which was in my template session. You know, I have these vocals labeled Akil vocals. He's the featured artist on the song, and those are bused to an Akil bus. I've got my guitars. I have one group of guitars that's bused to guitar 1 bus, and then there's another group bused to guitar 2 bus. So basically, I'm trying to keep organized, and I'm grouping. I'm making instrument groups, sending them to their corresponding buses so that I can then, you know, put processing on them and process them in a certain way. And I'll get into that as we go along. But the first thing you would want to do is build a static mix. And what that means is you would either start the tracks at 0 and sort of pull down the instruments that aren't as important. You might start with the most important elements of the song. So for example, you might start with your faders all down, pulled down completely, and bring up the vocals. And might work on the vocal mix. Then you might bring in some musical elements, the bass and the drums. Some people start off with drums, bass, add in the musical elements, and then do a vocal mix. It really is up to you and whatever system you've created. Or you can approach it based on what you think the most important parts of the song are, or you know, what the driving elements of the song are. So building a static mix could also, I mean, it's really nothing more than setting fader levels. You can get into panning, but all you're doing at this point is, you know, setting rough balances, making sure you can hear the different elements of the song before you go into adding any processing. I will also listen through the song from beginning to end and label the sections of the song. So as you can see here, it's intro, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, so on and so forth. Again, that's just so that I can move quickly when I want to get to a specific section of a song. That also helps. That also helps in when you want to get creative in how your mix is progressing. I know, okay, we're in the pre-chorus, something needs to change. So that also is a great thing, great habit to create. All right, so let's get into a little bit of processing. Do we have any questions yet? Let's see. Okay, not yet. All right, so as you can see, got my drums, and let me solo those so you can hear what that sounds like. Stand by. Got our drum group. So here are my drums, and I'll play them for you. Okay, here we go. Pretty simple. So as you can see, pretty simple program drums. And, you know, I actually, in doing this mix, I believe I started with building the mix from the drums, and then I went through the bass, the musical elements, and I did the vocals last. And if you remember from what I was playing, the vocals are very different from section to section. So I knew that those would take the most time, so I decided to just build up the drums, the bass, and the musical elements before I got to the vocals. So that's what I did. As you can see, you know, there's pretty minimal processing on the drums. On the kick, I started off with an EQ. And I didn't do much but boost at 200, which is what they call, if you wanted to add some knock to the bass. And depending on the bass, that knock might be in a different frequency, you know, give or take a few. But that's why I added that at 200. And then I compressed it just a little bit. It's not doing much. Let's see. Yeah. It's really not doing that much. Cool, but the kick sounded great to me from what they've sent, so I didn't feel like I needed to do too much. You know, I did sort of the same type of thing on each track. I'm actually sending the kick to a side chain, which I put on my bass. So that whenever the kick hits, the attack of the bass ducks a little bit, and that's great for, you know, just making space. And that's a common technique used in a lot of pop, a lot of EDM and dance music. But that's a great technique to get down if you need it. Some songs don't need it. I thought it worked great for this song. You know, and then we have some snares. I didn't do much. I felt like they sounded fine. You know, let me talk a little bit about my approach to EQ. Now, this is a digital parametric EQ. This is actually an older version. It's the FabFilter Pro Q2. Now you can get the Pro Q3, which is great, which I have. A lot of the plugins I'm using in this session are a little bit older because I hadn't upgraded at the time. But this is a great transparent EQ, which I usually use. I'll usually use first, and digital parametric EQs are great because they're really transparent, and I usually use them for like corrective reasons when I'm trying to fix problems or take things away. And then we have EQs that we'll reach for that are modeled after analog gear, and a lot of those EQs or compressors add some kind of character to the sound, and it could be tonally, it could be you know, just some kind of character that you would use to sort of sweeten your sound. But I usually use those later in my chain. And then these drums are all bused to a drum bus. And honestly, I usually use a compressor on my drum bus. I didn't feel like it needed it. Again, with programmed drums, in this case, they were all pretty consistent as far as level. So I just actually have this limiter on that's not doing that much. So not a lot happened to the drums. Also, I set up a drum verb where I'm sending, here's my drum verb. I'm sending a little bit to some reverb, and that's great to create some type of ambience. You know, because they're programmed drums, I do tend to send a little bit on the snares and the hi-hats to the reverb just to give them some just a little bit of a live feel. All right, so we got a question coming in. Stand by. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I was getting there. So the question that just came in is, when the mix sounds muddy, what's a good way to break up the sounds so it doesn't sound so heavy? Perfect timing. So we can actually get into talking about masking, which which happens when you have more than one sound that is occupying the same space on the frequency spectrum. A lot of times that will happen with kick and bass, and the way you would approach that is you will pull out a certain frequency where they're both occupying, and I'll show you. So this is my kick. This is my kick EQ. Let me bring up my bass. So this is my kick EQ, which I boosted at 200. On my bass, I actually pulled down at around 60 hertz. As I was playing, and I'll solo them for you, once I pulled out that frequency, it really opened up the bass and made it sound a lot clearer, and gave the bass its space and gave the kick its space. On the bass, I'm actually also rolling off at 40 hertz, which I often do, which also adds a lot of clarity to the bass. So I'll actually solo the bass and kick for you to demonstrate the idea of masking. Stand by. That's my kick, that's my bass. Now I'll take out the EQ on the bass so you can hear the space they're occupying. Stand by. Here we go. Okay. So now as you hear, like, the bass is sort of taking up a lot more space and is a bit unclear. So now when I pop that EQ in, the bass is a lot clearer. The kick and the bass they have their own little space, and I think it sounds great. I hope that answered your question. Okay, so now let's move on to bass, which I actually did a lot too. Now I'll play you what the bass sounded like before I did anything to it. So it's fine, a simple synth bass. I usually actually add a little bit of distortion to sub basses because that helps those low basses poke out on smaller speakers. But in this case, it didn't need it because there's actually a bit of, I don't know if it's distortion or if it's just part of the synth sound, but it already had that whatever I would do to make that frequency poke out, it already had it. But I felt like the bass could use more bass. Like, I felt like it could use more low end. So I added this R-Bass plugin, which is one of my favorite plugins. It's great on basses. I use them on kicks sometimes. But in this situation, and basically, actually, let me explain what it is. It's a plugin that adds harmonics to your bass sound, and depending on where you place that frequency, so right here it's at 40 hertz, it's going to give me a little bit more low end. It's going to give me a little bit more low end, or the idea of low end, and there's an intensity. So this is the harmonics it's adding, and you can sort of adjust the level. And this is the original sound. Not take that away. See, when I take it away, it gets a lot thinner. Add that in, and you can hear it. You can hear that come through. Cool. So that's one of my favorite plugins to use. I ended up EQing a little bit of compression. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. This is a side chain compressor. So this is the kick signal coming through. So anytime the kick hits, the bass ducks a little bit. And that's also great for creating space for those two elements to live. And then I limited it a little bit just to bring the sound up. and then I also boosted a lot of that top end. Sounds great. Awesome. Okay, we got another question coming through. Right. I think I'm getting this question late, but it was a question about side chaining, and I'll say it again in case you missed it. So right now I'm side chaining a kick and the bass. So anytime the kick, so basically I'm sending my kick to a bus, and then on my bass track on the compressor there's a side chain input. And on that side chain input, I have the bus of that kick, that bus that I created to send the kick. So now every time the kick hits, the bass ducks a little bit, just momentarily. And that's great at just creating space between the kick and bass, so that they, are just, it's something you can do besides EQ to let these elements, just give these elements a place to live. Cool. All right, so let's move on down to one of the most important elements of the song was this pad, which is a great sound. And my only issues with that were, and I'll play what it sounded like before. Oops. Still really great, but really full. And there's a lot of mid-range in there that can get in the way of your bass and the vocals. So I wanted to thin it out a little bit, but not too much. I wanted to thin it out, but also, so take out those mid-range frequencies. And also, while maintaining the body so the first EQ I did actually just rolled off a lot of the low end, and I'm rolling off at actually 196. That's pretty drastic. And then a little dip at 300, which was sort of a lot of where that mud lies. And then I actually put this plugin, which I really love. I believe it's a mastering plugin, but I use it a lot on pads. And the way I'm using it is I'm pulling down some of the level in the center. So this is a stereo pad. I'm pulling down a little bit the energy that's in the center of that track. And then I'm boosting the frequencies, so the low and the high frequencies to the side. So I'm trying to create some space in the middle, so that you sort of hear that pad, sort of the edges of your stereo image. And then to accentuate that, I add an imager, which is pretty much widens that image. So I'll play that again, and here it is without the plugins. It's a lot fuller. And here it is without. It's a lot thinner, it still has some body to it, but it's not taking up as much space. Okay. Great. Okay, we got a question. Hey, Bunny on board, what's up? Right, the EQ, she was saying the EQ made a big difference on the bass in the kick, right? Yeah, exactly. All right, so, okay, we got a little bit of time. Let's see, what should we talk about? I guess I'll talk a little bit about how I treated the guitars. There are 8 guitar tracks, and they all had a really different style to them. And I'll flip around and show you where they are, and I'll play them for you. They were all pretty different. And as you can see in panning, I'm sort of like panning them left and right. you know, again, just to create space. Play guitars. And then there's there are some other guitars that come in a little bit later. So the guitars were actually difficult to deal, no, I wouldn't say difficult, but challenging to deal with because they all sort of are like fitting into the same frequency band. So the panning definitely helps. I think in this sort of distorted guitar, I believe I have quite a few plugins on it. One second. Let's see it. Oh yeah, so I'm distorting that a little bit, again, to give it a little bit more tone, a different tone than the other guitars. You know, on this lead, again, I'm distorting it a little bit, just bringing out different frequencies so that while all the guitars are playing, it creates some space. Okay, we got another question. How do you bring vocals to the front of the mix? All right, let's go to the vocals. Stand by, there are a lot of them in this session. I'll just mute. So again, I made these stem tracks at the bottom, at the end of my session, which are great for really just isolating large groups. So right now, just play those.
I ain't never really been a fighter. I just get so tired of being good. Ooh, so tired of being good. I just get so tired of being good. Doing what I should.
5 a.m. and now.
So as you can hear, each section has a very distinct vocal. The chorus, which starts the song, is sort of that fun, high-pitched vocal. And then as we get into the verse, it's a little bit more subdued and just sort of this normal vocal.
All I can even stop me.
In the pre-chorus, she's like pushing more. It's much more emotional.
Tired of being good. Ooh,
And then the chorus, we go back to that fun, high-pitched vocal. So I spent a lot of time really trying to be creative with the way I approach those vocals. To answer your question about how to bring vocals to the front of a mix, let's go to my vocal channel here. So, you know, the first thing I'll do is I'll compress however much I need to. I don't think I do.
5 a.m.
every corner. I didn't even get a word.
So, you know, I'm pretty
Shadows self-step and see you. My
conservative
reflection,
with
I don't really
compression.
think we're getting older.
Much, but
Speaking to myself with the
I'm
sweetest
using
tone.
a UAD 1176, so I'm compressing a little bit. And what compression does is it takes the quieter sounds in that signal, and it brings the level up a little bit so that your signal is more even. So that's what I'm trying to achieve when I'm compressing a vocal. And then I EQ'd it. I rolled off at about 90. I pulled out a lot of the mid-range, and in a vocal, especially a female vocal, anything between like 200 and 300 hertz is where you're gonna get that mud. It's gonna make it, you know, the vocals hard to hear, and these frequencies will poke out a lot. So it's important to just isolate those frequencies, and so I'm pulling out a lot in that area. And then I pulled out some at 2K because I think there was like some resonant frequencies poking out there. And then we'll just go down to the limiter. I usually have a limiter as the last, usually one of the last plugins in my chain for vocals, and that helps to bring those vocals to the front. And I'll do that for each group. So I'll do that on my lead vocal bus, and I'll do it on my background bus. And that definitely will help to bring your vocals to the front. So experiment with that. Awesome. Cool. So I'd also like to touch on, after we sort of bring our levels up and we figure out what we need. And, actually, let me just mention, if you don't need to add something, don't add it. If you don't think the sound needs a compressor, don't add it. If you don't think it needs to be EQ'd, don't EQ it. Don't do something just because you think you have to. This snare sounded fine to me, so I didn't do anything to it. This other snare sounded fine to me. I didn't do anything to it. The only reason why I even touched that kick was to make space for the bass. And also, if you're going to treat a group of sounds the same way, for example, I'll show you my background vocals. Stand by. There's very minimal. This is one group. There's nothing on the tracks. Very minimal processing, and they're all bussed. And on that bus, stand by. Where's my bus? On that bus is where I'll compress and EQ and do anything I need to get them sounding great. But if you don't need to do anything to it, just leave it as is. Okay, I think we got another question. Stand by. How would you compare mixing on Pro Tools to Ableton Live or Logic? Trying to figure out if I should take the plunge. Man, I started mixing in Pro Tools for the most part. I think I think it's easier to navigate. The routing makes sense to me. The editing seems a lot easier to do in Logic, or a lot easier to do in Logic. It's a lot easier to do in Pro Tools than it is to do in Logic or Ableton. Logic is great for writing. I use it all the time for that purpose. And if I'm already in Logic, I'll stay there. I've learned how to mix in Logic. I don't have a problem with it. But my go-to is Pro Tools, just because I think the routing is easier, makes more sense. And Ableton, the mixing in Ableton can get a little quirky. The routing is very different from Pro Tools and Logic. Ableton was a program developed for DJs when it first started out, and then they got into production, and then they added in the ability to record and edit. But it was created for DJs, so a lot of the routing, a lot of the signal flow is just completely different from a lot of all the other DAWs. Logic and Pro Tools are the easiest, but Pro Tools just always been my go-to. I mean, that's what I know, that's what I learned on. But if you have if you have Ableton or Logic, just learn it the best you can. It's not about getting tools that other people have. If you have a piece of software, just learn it in and out. You can accomplish the same things. And that's my answer for that. We got another question. Can you talk about, hi Bunny, how's it going? Can you talk about, did I answer about blending background vocals? Sure. So let's find them. Again, when I start with background vocals, it's really all about panning. I mean, especially if you have parts that are the same. So as you can see here, these parts are identical. So she did, I believe it's a high harmony, and I just have them panned left and right equally, so 54, 57 ballpark. There's another set of harmonies that I have panned left and right. I mean, the same sort of thing. These are all harmonies here. So I'm really just using, the use of pan is awesome for backgrounds. And then there's a group of backgrounds that I wanted to EQ a little bit differently than the others to so that they don't get, I mean, again, it's the idea of masking. It's like she did all her backgrounds herself, so it's the same vocal. So a lot of the vocals are living in the same frequency. So I EQ'd the set of backgrounds a little bit differently so that you can differentiate them from the other group of backgrounds. Because I'll actually play the pre-chorus for you now. There are a lot of different parts going on at the same time, so it was important that you're able to hear all that. Let me play you the pre-chorus. Listen.
Been a fighter.
And let's get some music in there. And let's get some bass in there. Let's get some drums in there. Here we go.
Been a fighter. I just get so tired of being good. So tired of being good. I just get so tired of being good.
So there you go. And as far as blending, besides panning, I'm using, I'll talk a little bit about reverb. Let's see here. So I got my backgrounds, I'm compressing them as a group. This is actually a second set of backgrounds, and I'm rolling off some of the highs. I'm dipping in that lower mid-range area where we can get that mud. And then I'm rolling off a little bit. So yeah, the backgrounds are really just about panning. You might EQ them a little bit differently. And then the use of reverb to get them, let's see here. Yeah. So let's talk about reverb. I didn't get there. And we can talk about, actually I'll play you the verse into the pre-chorus because I want you to hear how the treatment of that lead vocal changes. So let's listen to that.
5 a.m. and I've been waiting on your calls. Oh, it's a real good game that you're playing on me. 5 a.m. and I'm driving where you want. Oh, it's a real good game that you're
Playing on me. Lately so poison. All I can do is stop. Got a real quick temper, far
This is the
from
verse.
a beginner. I don't really think I had a chance. Yeah, eyes I can never forget. I can never focus. You don't step in my dance in the whip, and I ain't never really been a fighter. I just get so tired of being good.
As you can hear on this pre-chorus, the lead vocals are a lot more than
I just get so tired of being good.
5.
So as you can hear in the chorus and the verses, the reverb, the verses are a lot drier. When we get to that pre-chorus part, we sort of doused it in reverb because we wanted that section to feel, just a lot differently emotionally. Like as you can hear in that section, I think that the strings come in. They actually had real strings. The strings come in. That vocal gets really emotional. So we wet it up. We just wanted it to feel different. We wanted it to lift and build up, because then once it builds up, it drops back down for the chorus, and you're in the chorus. So we played with a bunch of different reverbs, and let me show you what those are. Stand by. This very large session. We had a question? Any questions? As I find my lost reverb. Stand by. Here we go. Here we go. For these reverbs, I actually I don't use this that often. I used the Ghanaian-American reverb. Sounded great on And she's actually used that before, and I know it works great on her vocals, so I use that. And then I actually have a limiter after that, which just brings up the level, and then I'm rolling off some of the top end of that reverb to make it just a little darker. And you can experiment with how you EQ your reverbs. Depending on the mood of the song, you might want a lighter reverb. For this song, I felt like it lended itself to a darker reverb. And we got some questions. Stand by. What is your approach to organizing a session? Like the order of tracks, instruments, and buses? Yeah, I mentioned this at the beginning, but this is a process. I mean, you can do it any way you want to. This is a process that worked for me, and I just got into the habit of doing it this way. Just starting with my drums at the top. And then, I guess it would be like the lower frequency instruments, the rhythmic instruments I usually start with, so that's the order they appear in my session. So you'll have the drums, you'll have the bass, which are like the foundations of the track. And then I'll add in the musical elements. So you get into the pads, there's some piano. There's this was a sort of effecty vocal. So we got some guitars. And then we got into the vocals. So it's really just a system I created for myself. And I do it the same way every time. Again, just for, just like flow. Just so that like I know exactly where everything is, or I have an idea, and I can get to them quickly. Cool. All right. So also in that section, we also have in that pre-delay section where we got that really wet reverb. I also added delay, which really changes the vibe of the song.
Oh, it's a real good game that you're playing on me.
Wrong section.
I just get so tired of being good.
And as you can see, there wasn't any delay on any other section. So, I can go into now just how you can approach your mix creatively to, make changes from section to section. The arrangement in the song is pretty great, so it really does lend itself to this sort of build. But the pre-chorus was probably what I spent the most time on, because it was a section where she really wanted the strings to be prevalent, but also we needed to hear the vocal. So in this section, and I don't know if you can see my automations, so many tracks, but in the pre-chorus section, I brought the guitars down in level. I boosted the strings. So all you're really hearing is, actually I turned the keys up. I brought the guitars back, and the strings and the vocal, the primary aspects of the song at that moment. So it's important to really get in the habit of, what can I do in this section to make it different, to make it, fit the vibe of this section or the story. That's really important to think about. The outro of the song is also pretty cool because it sort of breaks down. All the guitars come in, it breaks down. And I was playing a lot with the guitar levels in this section. So let's hear that outro.
Might just come alive in the nighttime. I'm full of skills, so don't mind. Yeah, whatever take to get y'all feel fine. It's a real good game, but you're playing on me. Might just come alive in the nighttime. Yeah, I'm full of skills, so don't mind. Yeah, whatever take to get y'all feel fine. It's a real good game, but you're
Playing on me.
And I love that section because the background vocals are a little bit louder than the lead, and she loves that, actually. That's something we've done on a few of her mixes, but and she also always has tons of background, so it always feels really big and really full, and supports the lead vocals very well. Got any questions coming through? What haven't I talked about? Let's see. again, about background vocals, I don't think I did it this time, but I will add some type of chorus effect, which I guess I didn't do this time. But that also helps to put the background vocals in a different space than the lead, and that also creates space and makes them easier to hear. So that's something else I do pretty often. We got some questions coming through. Let's see. Bunny on board, coming through with the questions. The question is, what are some of your favorite quick keys? Wow, there's so many. Okay, well, for all you beginners out there, if you want to switch from your mix window to your edit windows, Apple equals. That's probably the first one you'll learn. Some of my favorite, I mean, in mixing, I guess I don't use them that often. I mean, I think this, I'll tell you, this one is very useful in A-Bing your affected track from the original. If you hit standby, if you press shift on a Mac, it's shift control option, you can deactivate all the plugins on a track. And that's great for if you want to audition or A/B what you've done to the track versus the original, because sometimes maybe you went too far. Maybe a lot of the original was pretty great. So I actually do that a lot. I will A/B just to make sure I'm keeping all the elements I liked about the sound, and I haven't gone too far down some rabbit hole. So that's great. That's pretty great. I guess that would be my favorite one in mixing. Hey Neil, what's up? The question is, how does Spiff, I have never used Spiff. Oh, how does Spiff work? So I'm using a plugin called Spiff. Right, so if I remember correctly, Neil, Soothe, which is made by the same company, which is OEK Sound. Soothe is, I believe, a multi-band compressor, so it will duck a certain frequency band if the volume gets over a certain level. With Spiff, I guess you could call it a multi-band expander, so it works in the opposite way. Once the level reaches a certain threshold, it will accentuate that sound by however many dB you placed it. So for example, on this bass, and I'll play. Let me solo that bass so you can hear that. So once it hits this threshold, it's really boosting that bass, and I did that just so that I could bring out some of that those higher harmonics in the bass, so that they do poke out on smaller speakers, and the bass is easier to hear. So that's the difference between Spiff and Soothe. Nice.
You know every corner, I ain't even get a warning. Shadows up, step and see you, my reflection. I don't really think we're getting older. Speaking to my soul.
Yeah, the use of buses is very will make you a lot more efficient. Also, obviously, take some pressure off your CPU. So, for example, I have this drum reverb that I'm using to send. I usually set up reverbs for drums, as I mentioned, but I'm sending, as opposed to, putting a reverb on each track. If you're going to be using the same reverb, you can just create a bus, put your reverb on that bus, and use a send to send the signal. And I do that for drums, obviously for vocals and guitar, all the way down the line. So really, I'm trying to do, this session I actually did a little while ago. With every subsequent session, I'm trying to achieve more by doing less. It's just finding different methods, as opposed to, loading a track up with plugins. Just really listening and trying to approach it in different ways. So, okay, we're nearing the end. I will talk a little bit about how I bounce my track or print my track. So when I'm printing a track for a client, I actually will print my track within ProTools. You don't have to do it that way. It's sort of a habit I picked up, coming up in a major studio. It was often the case that, the mix engineer would send their mix out to some sort of outboard gear or the console or summing or whatever and print back into Pro Tools. At one point, I also heard that you'd achieve better results if you printed within. I don't know if that's still the case, but I like it because I can also print my mix and listen to my final mix. And if there are things I want to fix, I can just punch in on that track. So basically, I have all my buses routed to this pre-mix track bus. Where I have, not doing anything there. I have an SSL compressor. And then I have the ML8 limiter, which I really love. I'm actually boosting a little bit in the high end and rolling a little bit off, but this was just for the client. So I would then print that mix like this. So now it's all routed to this track and then to my print track. And then I go through, print the whole thing. I'd export that. So now you don't have to do it this way. You can bounce to disk. That will work perfectly fine. I'd say when you're, you can bounce to disk, print with your limiter on, and that's the version you'd get to the client. If you are bouncing or exporting a mix for mastering, you'd have to take everything off your master bus. All your compressors, your limiters, EQs is debatable. If you were going for a very specific sound stylistically, I would leave it on. You could also just print a few different versions. But anyway, the rule of thumb is to take everything off your master bus, and then I would print another version for mastering, and I would send the version I printed for the client along with the version for mastering to the mastering engineer. When you're bouncing, exporting, you want to use at least 24 or 32-bit depth, and just bounce it or export it at the native sample rate. Also, I just want to mention, as far as the level, I try to leave about 3 dB of headroom for the mastering engineer. Let's see what the way this ended up. It's a lot lower than that, but at the loudest, I like to leave 3 dB of headroom for the mastering engineer once I take these plugins off. And then that's my mix. So we got a few minutes left. If there are any questions, of course we couldn't cover everything because there's so little time, but if you have any questions in the last few minutes, I'd love to answer. Oh, we got one. Thank you. So the question is, can I tell you about my Listen In series? So I'm starting a series called Listen In, which is going to be sort of this event where I give live feedback about submitted music. So if you're, an independent or up and coming artist, whatever, and you'd like to have some live feedback on your music, send it to listeninseries@gmail.com. And on August 31st at 8 p.m., we'll get on Instagram Live and we'll talk about your music. I'll also give you mix and production tips, and there will be time for Q&A. So I'm really excited about it. It's my first time doing something like that, but I've already received, a great number of submissions. So there's a lot of interest, and it would be a really fun time for anyone wanting to submit music and wanting feedback, but also anyone looking to learn, the things that come up, how do I mix my vocals? What can I do to help my track? How can I, whatever I need to do and it might be songwriting, production, mixing, and everyone's welcome, artists, producers, engineers, I'd love to have you. So that's August 31st. Just follow me on Instagram at Red Soul Music, and I'll be posting updates about that. But I think we're out of time. But I really thank you for joining me. I had a lot of fun breaking this down, and I hope we can do it again. So take care. Research as much as you can. Practice your craft and kill it. All right, take care. Bye.